Well, welcome once again to ARTbreak, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at portraits, or actually more specifically looking at what is going on or happening in a portrait. Portraits, I think we often tend to literally take at face value. We think, well, there's this person and that's what they look like. But there's really much more to it than that. A portrait really can give insight into that particular person, perhaps something of their attitudes that they wish to present to the world. It also can indicate their social status, how they relate to the society of their time. And then in the largest sense, it also gives a sense of the cultural values of a particular time or period in history. So to kind of lead us through all that, we're very fortunate to have back with us once again Dr. James Carter. Many of you longtime ARTbreak participants remember Jim has been a frequent guest here, often doing these fascinating programs about the intersection between art and medicine, which relates to his professional career, his longtime Kalamazoo physician. And in addition to his private practice, he also was an associate professor and program director of internal medicine at MSU and the Kalamazoo Center for Medical Studies. He also has a very long connection with art, and particularly the KIA. He started here many years ago as a student in photography class, and then subsequently he became a board member, the director of the board, and then he went back to sort of meet visitors firsthand, became a docent, and has led tours to various audiences. So again, we're delighted to have Jim back with us, this time talking about portraits, and please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. I don't think I deserve that, but thank you very much. I have three goals with this talk. My first goal is to highlight some of the outstanding portraits we have in our collection. And we have a great collection at the KIA. I want to look at the various elements of a portrait and help you read a portrait a little bit better. And then I want to go through some of the various styles of portraiture. So if we start looking at the history of a portraiture, this is in our collection. This is Matthew Brady. But portraiture as an art form has been around for at least 5 millennia, going back to ancient Egypt, perhaps even before then. Originally, it was used for religious or political propaganda, if you will. Then it became a form of idolatry. It was not until the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance time, where portraiture became an entity unto itself. And as Greg mentioned in his intro, it's more than just a picture of the person. We want to find out more about the culture. We want to find out their backstory in a portrait. Having said that, Oscar Wilde made a great quote. He said, "Every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not the sitter, and it's the painter who reveals himself." So let's explore that just for a moment. We're going to explore it with this portrait entitled Portrait of Farmer's Wife by Robert Gwathmey, 1954. This is a screen print in our collection. And I'll say just about everything that I'm going to show is in our collection. So we look at this portrait and we see there's a very simple composition. It's two-dimensional. It's kind of abstract. You may say, well, I see cubist elements, and I would not argue with you. I find it so interesting, the juxtaposition between the sitter, her name is Mrs. Sarah Wade, and the table. And we see them side by side. We see Mrs. Wade, an older woman of color. We see her rounded shoulders. We see her bent forward. She has that kyphoscoliosis, that kind of curvature, often from degenerative disease or maybe osteoporosis. She has her hands are enlarged, but they're gnarled. We see rheumatoid nodules on her hands. We see bunions on her feet. So we see a woman who's obviously had a fairly hard life next to a table a table that is either wood or metal, we can't tell for sure, but the table has strong geometric shapes, and it's got that little decorative, almost heart shape at the bottom of it, if you will. So a strong table and a woman of color, and the contrast between those two. I also noticed the chair behind Mrs. Wade, and I always look at this and I say, well, she's too proud to sit. For her portrait, she's going to stand, she's going to show the world what she is. So I find this fascinating. This is very typical of Gwathmey's style. If it reminds you of Jacob Lawrence, I think that's a correct statement. Gwathmey was a social realist. And as a social realist, he felt, and his group felt, that art could change the world. Art could influence society, if you will. And he typically portrayed man's inhumanity to man. He was very much for the civil rights movement, very much against the Vietnam War. And interestingly enough, he was under surveillance for 30 years by the FBI. This is a portrait also in our gallery on your left of Gwathmey, painted by his good friend Philip Evergood. So both of those are in our collection. Now, Gwathmey, this is a screen print. Gwathmey's original painting was oil on canvas. It's in the Smithsonian. It was widely acclaimed as just a wonderful portrait of a woman of color. So he decided to increase the circulation of this by doing a screen print. And since the 1930s, Gwathmey had been doing screen printing, and he became a master at screen printing. If you can look at the original when it's out on display, you'll see how clean and crisp his lines are as a screen printer. He was asked by the Smithsonian to comment on this painting of the original oil on canvas, and he said, "Farmer's wife is my response to a lady of character who has borne the scars of outrageous circumstances and has refused to be destroyed. It is my hope that I might be able to extend the beauty and dignity of this wonderful lady." Now, he did know her. This was the cook and domestic of his wife, Rose Lee, and they lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. Gwathmey made 200 of these screen prints. They sold out instantly, and they really distributed his message quite widely. Well, let's look at something that's a little bit more recent, if you will. This is a photograph. It's not in our collection. I know the photographer very, very well, and he would be willing to donate to the collection if asked. But as Greg mentioned, portraits reflect social realities, they reflect behavior, they reflect the appearance of the time. The first photograph was actually taken in 1826, so we're coming up to 200 years of photography. Digital photography and iPhone photography, many of us, myself included, felt that this would be the virus that destroyed portraiture. This would be it for portraiture, because everybody could take an iPhone a picture. Fortunately, that's failed to be true. Fun facts about iPhone photography. 93% of all photos in 2023 will be taken with a smartphone or an iPhone. Greater than 80% of these will be portraits. The average person, the average one of us in this room, take 20.2 portraits per day. That's maybe a lot for this room. It's not for my granddaughter. And that's 1.81 trillion photos per year. To give you a more manageable number, that's 57,246 photographs per second. In a person's lifetime, in my lifetime, if I had a smartphone that never needed charging, if I held the photo button down for 77 years, I could never still make 1.8 trillion. It's a phenomenal number. The average US user has 2,000 images on their phone. I think most of you can understand that. The average European takes 597 selfies per year. I don't know why they're more vain than we are. Most photographs are taken by the Japanese people. If you've been to Japan, you know that's a true statement. And if you share on media, it's 14.2 billion per day, and that's because you share on Facebook, you share on Instagram, you share on Snapchat, you share on everything. So there's a lot of photographs going around the internet. Let's continue with our talk on portraits. And this is a portrait done by Steve Wessel, 2017. It's crayon and graphite on paper. And here we see a woman of color in a lotus position. Lotus position is used for meditation. It's a simple, but it's a strong composition. Steve Wessel does a marvelous job with her hair, and that hair and her position, her lotus position, gives us that triangular shape, if you will. Again, that strong triangle that artists actually love. We look at her, her gaze is looking at us or through us. I think it always looks through me. Between her eyebrows, she has those dots called bindai, which are from the Hindu tradition of piety, energy, and strength. But it's a complex. I mean, it looks simple, but it's actually very complex. The complexity of how he did her hair, the complexity of her jewelry. She has a nose ring, she has hoop earrings, she has a choke collar, she has a necklace, she has rings, she has bracelets, and she's sitting kind of formally in either a sarong or a dress, not sweats, not shorts, not jeans. So it's a simple but complex portrait. Now, Steve Wessel is considered one of the great representational figurative artists of this century. His portraits are described as empathetic, ennobling, and psychologically penetrating. He teaches at NYU. He's a New York native. But interestingly enough, in 2017, he did a workshop here at the Curtin Newman Art School. And I don't know if anybody participated in that workshop. It was a joint workshop in the art school. And so I do not know if this portrait came from the school or was done before or after. But anyway, this is a portrait, and I use this to talk about really one of my main themes, and that's how to read a portrait better. After the lecture, I made a quick handout on the elements that I'm going to talk about. And this came from the Smithsonian, from the National Portrait Gallery. It talks about the elements of portraits. And there's 10 elements of portraits. I think there's 11, and I'll explain that in a second. But much of this, I think, is kind of intuitive. Facial expression is important. Pose, clothing, hairstyle, and setting are important. If we think about facial expression for a second, think about facial expression. There's really only 6 facial expressions that we have. There's surprise, disgust, anger, sadness, fear, and happiness. Now, I understand that there's a spectrum of happiness. Are you happy, ecstatically, or are you just kind of happy? So there's a wide range in each of those elements, but there's 6 elements: surprise, disgust, sadness, anger, fear, and happiness. Now think about this. Those facial expressions are common to all humanity. They're common irrespective of race. They're common irrespective of ethnicity. Those are common expressions. So facial expressions really are extremely important in portraits. These facial expressions help us understand the thoughts and the feelings of the sitter in particular. Now, the pose is important because it tells us how people want to be perceived. The setting also gives us part of the story, if you will, of the sitter. Continuing on with what the National Portrait Gallery says, objects are extremely important. Objects are symbols. And if you kind of close your eyes and think of some of the very famous portraits, like the portrait of George Washington, and you see the objects, the elements that are in that painting, they tell you the story. They tell you his story. They tell you his accomplishments. They tell you who he is. So objects are symbols, and they're extremely important. Color is important for the mood, and we're going to give some examples of that. Scale is important, particularly the size of the sitter in the overall artwork. So in this case, with Steve Wessel, this is all about the sitter. This is all about this young lady who's sitting there. And then the style that the artist chooses to use is important, and we'll see, again, examples of that. So if I said facial expression is the first thing I'm going to talk about, many of you would say, yep, Winston Churchill. This is facial expression right here. This portrait, as many of you know, was taken in December 30th, 1941. It was taken in Ottawa, Canada. It was taken right after Churchill addressed the Canadian Parliament. Churchill addressed the Parliament, came back into the back room. He quickly lit a cigar. The Prime Minister of Canada said, please, Mr. Churchill, can we take a portrait of you? And he grumbled, I'll give you 2 minutes. And so Joseph Karsh, the photographer, said, Mr. Churchill, please put your cigar down. The smoke is interfering with the camera or whatever. And Churchill, of course, refused. So Mr. Karsh went up to Mr. Churchill to adjust his lapel and do some things that the portrait artist always does, and grabs a cigar, takes a picture. And Mr. Karsh said, the look was so belligerent, I thought I was going to be devoured by Mr. Churchill. But in fact, this was the look that they needed at the time. You know, this is 1941, excuse me. This is a look of defiance. This is a look of unconquerability. This was a look that they had to have. This was taken moments later. That's not the same look that they want to give to the world. So back to the roaring lion, as it's called. Dates are important. Greg and I were talking right before the talk about, you know, it's not in the portrait, it's not in our little handout here, but I think dates are the 11th element of a portrait. Actually, I think they're an element in all art. And when I look at art, actually, the first thing I do is actually look at the date even before I look at the artist or the name of the portrait. So dates, I think, are really important. This was December 1941. So the United States had entered the war earlier that month. Churchill was now over in Canada getting ready to go down to see FDR. But the United Kingdom, UK had gone through the Blitz, which is 56 consecutive days and nights of bombing of London. You've seen those pictures. U-boats, the German U-boats, had pretty much closed off the North Atlantic to shipping. The U-boats were sinking cruisers, sinking UK battleships. In North Africa, Rommel was running unchecked. You know, this is dire. This is really bad for the United Kingdom. And so we needed this look of, I am unconquerable. And at the time, many people were thinking, you know, England's going to have to sue for peace because they can't get goods, they can't get supplies. The Germans just beating them up. So this was the look that was needed. Now, Joseph Karsh, there's a little backstory. In a second, Joseph Karsh immigrated to Canada. He was a survivor of the Armenian genocide, which is part of the Ottoman Empire. By the 1930s, he was a significant photographer in Canada, but he stated that my portrait of Winston Churchill changed my life. I realized the moment I took it that this was significant. Now, interestingly enough, we did not own this photograph in 2011. In 2011, we did a show at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts entitled Karsh Regarding Heroes. It was curated by the Art Institute of Chicago. Mrs. Karsh came to the show, saw the little KIA, saw how we put the show together. She was so pleased, she offered us two portraits. And we did not own this one. In fact, these were very, very scarce, the Churchill. And Jim Bridenstine or Vicki Wright at the time said, well, gee whiz, yeah, we'd love to have the Churchill. She said, okay, it's yours. What other one do you want? Well, how about the Picasso? Well, fine, it's yours. So when you go online and look at the collection, you'll see, you know, that it was donated by Mrs. Karsh in honor of her husband for our show. Now, if I said pose or setting, you know, as an important element of portraiture, some of you that know our collection really well say, yep, Truman Capote, 1948. And, you know, the artist is Irving Penn, and the artist decided to do some kind of innovative things. He took two studio flats, he put carpet on them, put them together at an angle. And the angle is more than 90 degrees. The angle is about 120 degrees. And then he told his subjects, his sitters, go in there and pose any way you want to. You know, I will give you anything, a device or anything that'll fit in that sharp angle, but do your thing. And so Truman Capote, age 24, wedges himself into the corner. His head's resting on his right shoulder. You know, I've tried to describe his gaze. I think it's a haunting gaze. You may have better words than that. He's enveloped in this coat. He's using the chair as a prop. He's using the wall to lean against. And I keep thinking, you know, he's asking me, who do you think I am? You know, kind of thing. But Capote, 24 years old. Truman Capote had kind of a tough life as a child. His parents went through a bitter divorce. He was shuffled between relatives in Louisiana and New Orleans. He finally, in high school, got to come up with his mother and her new husband to New York. He graduated from high school, went no farther in education, but he started writing short stories about his life. And by the early or mid-1940s, he is acclaimed as an up-and-coming author. He had just completed, by the time he sat here, he had just completed his first book, and the book was entitled Other Voices, Other Rooms. And this is a semi-autographical book about a boy's search for his father and a boy's search for his own sexuality. Age 24, Truman Capote is very open about his homosexuality, is very open about being gay. A tough time for gay men and gay women in the 40s and 50s, and actually even into the 60s. But he was very open about this. And I don't know if the pose had to do with that or not. Irving Penn is a name you may not recognize, but he truly was one of the great photographers of the 20th century. You have seen his pictures. You've seen many of his pictures in Vogue magazine. He was the lead photographer for Vogue for over 60 years. But he loved to do these little projects. And he called this project Portraits in a Corner. So again, he put the flats, he made the angle very steep. He said, go in there and pose any way you want. So someone like Joe Louis posed for him, put his arms against the flats like he was going to knock down the walls like a Hercules. Duchess of Windsor, you may recall this picture, she's scrunched into the corner, and I mean, her shoulders are confined by that tight angle. Duke Ellington tries to get his entire band in the corner. That didn't work very well, but Irving Penn took the picture. So Irving Penn said that using portraits in a corner brought out their personalities. Because of the confinement, they were comfortable posing for me. So it's just a very interesting take on posing. So posing is very important, and setting is very important in looking at portraits. Now, if we look at color, and we look at background and artistic technique, this is a Cassiopeia by Fred Wessel, 2014, egg tempera with gold leaf and silver. And if it's up, I really want you to see this. It's just absolutely stunning. The colors are so brilliant. So basically, it's only two colors, blue and gold, a little bit of green, but blue and gold. The egg tempera is an old technique. Egg tempera has been around since the 1st century CE. It wasn't until mid-Renaissance that it was replaced by oil, but it's still used. And we have a couple egg temperas on display right now downstairs. What I want you to do is think about how the artist used technique, egg tempera, and two colors to tell the story of Cassiopeia. And Cassiopeia is from Greek mythology. Cassiopeia is about the story about a very vain queen, Cassiopeia. So, Cassiopeia boasted that she and her daughter were the most beautiful women in the world. Now, Poseidon decided that's not true. He felt that his nieces, the sea nymphs, daughters of Nereus, were the most beautiful women in the world. And Poseidon decides, well, I'm not going to take this line down. I'm going to get Cassiopeia. I'm going to get Andromeda. So he directs a kraken, a monster. And he directs this monster to go after Cassiopeia, to eat her, to devour the country. Cassiopeia decides, well, I can stop this kraken from destroying me and my country by chaining my daughter, Andromeda, to the rocks on the sea, and the kraken will eat Andromeda and save me most importantly, but my country secondarily. So you hear Andromeda, you can get a sense of her screaming as she's chained to the rocks, and you see the kraken coming, and overhead flies Perseus. Perseus is a great warrior of all Greek mythology, if you will. And he sees this maiden, and he runs down, he saves her, then he sees the kraken, and he kills the kraken. But Poseidon wasn't real happy with that. So Poseidon says, wait a minute, I'm not going to let Cassiopeia get away with this. So he grabs Cassiopeia, changes her to a throne or a chair of torture, we don't know, changes her to a throne, throws her into the heaven where she is a constellation. And the constellation is in the right upper part in the blue sky. It's formed a 5-star big W, and that represents the throne, if you will. So that's the story of Cassiopeia. So we think of how did he use colors and technique and so forth. Well, the technique, egg tempera, as you all know, is a media that you have to do layer upon layer upon layer of paint. It gives you tremendous depth and gives you deep, rich colors. We look at the colors. We look at the blue in the sky in the upper quadrant. We look at the blue of her gown. We look at the blue of her eyes. In the gold leaf, in the background, we have blues in some of the stars. We have gold leaf immediately behind Cassiopeia, but we have gold in her hair. We have gold trim in her gown. We have gold trim on gold beadwork on the bodice of her gown. We have even gold in the flowers by the palm fronds. So, I think he uses his technique to give us a very rich painting, but certainly the colors, I think, denote wealth, denote royalty, denote fame. So I think it works very effective for this portrait. Continuing on with our story, or our theme of how the elements from the National Portrait Gallery tell a story. This is about artistic technique and composition. This is entitled Madonna by Elizabeth Catlett, 1982, and it's a lithograph in our collection. And I'm always struck by this. I see, as I look at it initially, I see two strong geometric shapes. I see kind of a rectangular box, but then on top of it is an arch, a semicircle. And that arch forces Madonna's head down into the composition. So the arch forces her into the composition, but the arch around her and even highlighting her hair almost looks like a halo. And certainly halos are important to deify people. So I see strong geometric shapes. And then inside those geometric shapes, I see a strong vertical element of the arm, a strong horizontal element of the forearm with the hand, and then these kind of powerful round circles of the faces. So I see a lot of geometric strength, but then I look at the faces, I look at the heads of the people, and I'm thinking, wow, each face is kind of giving me a different message. I get messages, and again, you'll have your own thoughts on this, but I see messages of concern, confidence, and consoling. So I think all the elements focus on these these oval circles, if you will, which are the faces of the Madonna and her two children. And I think it becomes a very powerful portrait because of that. Elizabeth Catlett, I think many of you know, she felt very strongly that art should serve all of mankind. Art is the strongest form of communication we have. Her subjects were all American, but they're all American with African heritage. Her common themes were mother and child and maternal love and womanhood. Elizabeth Catlett had a very interesting story. I encourage you to read more about her. She's a granddaughter of enslaved grandparents. A month before she was born, her father died. Her mother raised her as a single parent. Education was extremely important in their family, so she has a baccalaureate degree. And her MFA was University of Iowa. And at the University of Iowa, her mentor was Grant Wood. And her mentor taught her, or told her, and she followed for the rest of her career, one piece of advice: do art that you know about. Do what you know. And so her entire career has been looking at women of African descent. So if we think about objects, this is one that I've always found haunting. This is entitled Marie Laveau by Renee Stout in 2009 as a lithograph. Before I look at the objects, the thing that I find so interesting is she uses basically just one color. She uses sepia. Sepia is a combination of red and brown, and by changing the transparency of the sepia, we get kind of a reddish halo around her beautiful afro. Again, kind of deifying that halo effect, if you will. I look at this and I'm just, fascinated by her eyes and her mouth. Those eyes are penetrating. The mouth, I think, tells a good story. The objects that we have, we see the handheld fan. And fans are symbols of wealth. They're symbols of royalty. They are symbols that go back to Babylon. They are symbols that go back to ancient Egypt. And then we look at the snake. And the snakes, of course, we all know they lose their skin. Snakes are considered a life-creating force. They're considered immortality. So they have tremendous significance. This is a Marie Laveau. Marie Laveau was a woman of color. She was born in New Orleans in 1801. She died in 1881. Her father was a white politician, Frenchman. Her mother was a woman of color, but also had Native American blood. Her mother was a voodoo princess. Marie Laveau followed her mother, was a practitioner of voodoo. She was an herbalist. She was a healer. She was a midwife. She was kind of the central social hub of New Orleans. People of all strata, whites, blacks, Native Americans, everybody went through Marie Laveau. So she kind of knew everything. She was the healer. She took care of family disputes. She helped them with finances. She helped them with their own health. She did own a snake. Her snake was called Zombie, and it was after the African god Damballa, again implying creativity, force, and rebirth. Now, Renee, I show a portrait also in our collection of Renee Stout. Now, I show this because, as you can imagine, Marie Laveau did not want pictures taken of her. She's a voodoo princess. She knew the power that people could use of her picture. She knew this. So if she didn't have any photographs, she wouldn't let anybody take her portrait or paint her portrait as such. So any painting of Marie Laveau is really secondhand, not with her sitting for the portrait. But Renee Stout, her major theme in her artwork is looking at the spiritual roots of her African American heritage. So looking at the spiritual roots, you understand why she might want to look at Marie Laveau. But what do I do for her face? Well, Renee Stout used her own face. So this is her likeness that she used to paint Marie Laveau. So I use this way as a segue into self-portraits. Clever. Throughout history, self-portraits have been a tried and true practice of artists. Now, this is also in our collection. This is Rembrandt, that Rembrandt, the one you know, leaning on a windowsill. And it's on paper, 1639 was the date of this, 1639. So Rembrandt supposedly had about 100 self-portraits made. He had 40 paintings, he had 31 etchings, he had a number of drawings, and a number of sketches. Now, more recent scholars of Rembrandt say that probably only half of these, quote, self-portraits were in fact done by him. The others were done by students in his studio. But over his 4 decades of professional career, if you line up all these self-portraits, you really get a good picture of Rembrandt, the highs of his career, the lows of his career, the bankruptcy of his career, and so forth. So you get a very good picture of him. Now, this self-portrait is an etching, and of the 31 etchings, Rembrandt only allowed 4 to be, quote, official etchings. The rest, we have pictures of them, but they really are not approved. Of the 4 that he approved, then he would make a lot of prints and distribute them to his dealers, his patrons, use them for advertising. So this is one of the 4 approved etchings of Rembrandt, and we think it's a very close likeness of what he looked like at the time in 1639. A self-portrait is a mirror revealing an artist's mind. It's highly subjective. It's a highly subjective image since the artist reveals only to the viewer what they want to reveal. So in other words, the artist has total control over the self-portrait. Now, self-portraits transcend technique. They're present in every movement from the Renaissance to contemporary. But self-portraits are more than just a realistic image. They can be humorous. They can be emotional self-portraits. So this is a humorous self-portrait. This is Robert Arneson up against it in our collection. And I've always looked at this portrait, and you're struck immediately by the face. And you see that face, and I always think, I remember when copy machines first came out, and I remember putting my face on that and taking a picture of my face. I remember friends putting body parts on that and taking pictures that I did not do. So I think of the copy machines, but I think of driving down the road. My wife and I are driving down the road. We pass a car with a bunch of kids in the back seat. The kids slam their face against, and they stick their tongue out. And that's great. I think of the Marx Brothers, and I think of the Marx Brothers on a glass revolving door. And Groucho gets out first. He puts his foot down and stops the door, and Harpo slams his face into the glass. I think of things like that. I look at this, and I see a very interesting technique. It's almost a pointillistic technique. It's very expressionistically playful. But I look at that, and I see how he uses a very fine stroke to convey colors. And I see a unique group of colors, blues and oranges and reds. And if any of you had the opportunity to go to Detroit this past winter to see Van Gogh, this reminds me of Van Gogh, self-portrait. How Van Gogh would do it. I find that just fascinating. So despite everything I thought about him putting his face on a window or him putting his face on a copy machine, Arneson says, well, this is actually my face on a glass slide with a cover slip pressing my face down to be examined by a microscope. This is me getting ready to be examined by a microscope. Now, on the left, you see a picture of Arneson. So it's not a bad likeness of him. On the right, on your right, we see his typical style, the ceramic stuff they did. Arneson was very big and one of the originators of funk art. Funk art. Funk art was a reaction to abstract expressionism. It was an anti-establishment movement, if you will. And if I said, where do y'all think funk art started? You all raise your hands and say, California, the Bay Area, San Francisco, and that's correct. That's where all this started. It was Northern California. The funk art movement used a lot of ceramics, but it was non-functional ceramics, like what we see on the right, the flip and the flop. They used everyday objects. They often were autobiographical. They often were humorous, but sometimes kind of rough humor, and they often had sexual undertones or even occasionally sexual overtones. Arneson is quoted, his biography says that Arneson frequently used self-portraits as a means to examine his relationship to himself and the world. So, funk art. This is another self-portrait in our collection, February Flower, self-portrait by Carson Criti, again a lithograph of 2009. And we know that it's February, the title tells us that. So we know it's February. We just got through February. We know how dark the sky was. We see a horizon line. We see the land is dark, is dank. We're tired of February. We're just tired of it. But we have a young boy who's also not showing much in the way of color or any kind of vitality. He's holding a flower. He's holding a fairly detailed flower. We see the petals, but we see no color in the flower. We see no color in the sky. We see no color in the background. We see no color in his face. The only color is his shirt. And so Winston Churchill is saying, well, he's looking outward for vitality. He's looking outward for his energy. And in fact, he should be looking inward. And so this is a portrait of Carson Criti from the website of the University of New Mexico, where he's a professor of printmaking. And he says the obvious, this doesn't look like me. We know that. But he says, my portraits are not about looking like me. My portraits are about the common human condition of emotional state. And so that's what he does. He does his self-portraits about, as best he can describe, his emotional state or his search for emotional state. So abstract portraits are inherently much more personal as compared to other types of representational art. I think your experience and my experience are the same. Abstract portraits invite a far deeper and more profound conversation, if you will. And this is actually the portrait that got me going on my search for portraits and understanding portraits. This is a portrait of Elaine de Kooning by Mary Abbott, 1948, oil on canvas. It's downstairs in the collection on Unveiling American Genius. So we look at this and we see pleasing, warm palette. We see maybe cubist elements. The background certainly looks like abstract expressionism, of which both Mary Abbott and Elaine de Kooning were first-generation abstract expressionists. The background, the blocks of color really help us highlight the figurative elements more in the foreground, although this is a flat painting, but more in the foreground. And so we look at this portrait of Elaine de Kooning. We see that she's giving us direct eye contact, if you will. I follow the eyes down the nose, I follow the nose to the lips, I see a little bit of a curl of a smile. I follow down below the lips, I see a V in her blouse. The V takes me right down to her cat, which is black and white, you can't miss it. And the cat's on top of a white book that you can't miss. And then I see these green hands, and these green hands come to the forearms take me to the elbows take me back to the shoulders, and I have a nice triangular shape, if you will, which is a very strong shape in the world of art. So I see this as my art, my eyes moving throughout this painting. Now, Mary Abbott, I think you get a feel for this as you look at the portrait. Mary Abbott and Elaine de Kooning were friends. They were very good friends. Mary Abbott was a little bit younger than Elaine de Kooning, came in the abstract expressionist world a little bit later than Elaine. Elaine, of course, was married to William. William and Elaine had a very unusual relationship. They had what would be called an open marriage. Shortly after Mary Abbott arrived on the scene and was taken under the wing by Elaine de Kooning, Mary Abbott and Elaine's husband, William, had started being romantically linked, which they were for many years. But Elaine approved of it. She thought it was great. In fact, she thought that if Bill had to do it again, Mary would have been a better wife for him than she was. Well, I show two examples, one on your left. This is fairly typical of Mary Abbott's abstract expressionist style. She did almost no representational work at all, very, very little. On the right is in our collection, a lithograph by Lange Cuny. Again, abstract expressionists. Again, very, I don't see any figurative elements in either one of these. But if we look at Lange Cuny again, this portrait, and on our right we see one of the most famous portraits, really in the country at this point, that's at the National Portrait Gallery of JFK, done by Lange Cuny. Now, Lange Cuny, as an abstract expressionist, very early on, realizing the discrimination that these women were facing in their art careers, started adding figurative elements to her art. And so for decades, she had figurative elements in her art, and she kind of hit the pinnacle of her art career when she did this portrait of JFK on the right. So I look at this, I go back to, again, the portrait of Lange Cuny in the center of the field, and I think, okay, here's an artist, Mary Abbott, didn't do figurative work at all. She wants to paint her really good friend, even despite her with her husband. She wanted to paint a really good friend. How is she going to paint it? She paints it in the style of Lange Cuny. She paints it in her style to honor her friend. I think that's amazing. I think that's incredible. And it really works. You can tell, again, by looking at the portrait, that they like each other. They really did. So I think that's fantastic. This is another portrait. Again, I find fascinating. I find them amazing. Mother and child, Maynard Dawson, 1912, oil on canvas, also downstairs, hanging in Unveiling American Genius. Maynard Dawson was actually one of the first artists in the world to do mostly abstract work. Now, this is 1912. So, there's things going on in Europe, but Maynard Dawson really wasn't following the European lead, if you will. If you look at this and you say, well, I see what looks like abstract expressionism, I see what looks like cubism, not going to argue with you on that. In my very simple mind, I think of cubism as a simple deconstruction, reconstruction, a person, place, or time. That's all cubism is deconstruction and reconstruction. And whether you add elements in or out is a different story. But so I see this, I see warm colors. I see all these geometric shapes. I see lines, I see zigzags, I see crosses, I see dots. But everything in the background is pointing you to the figurative elements in the center of this painting. So our eyes are forced into this figurative element. And the figurative element, we know it's mother and child. I see a mother. I see the face. I see what looks like a hairline. I see two eyes. I see a nose. I see a mouth. If you look at the face, think of the face as being two halves, being two emotions. And when you go down and look at it, maybe you get a better feel for the next time you go down and look at Maynard Dawson. There's a happy side and maybe a not so happy side of the face. Think about it for a while if you can get downstairs. But I look at the figurative elements. I see the face. I see what looks like a gown. I see shoulders. I see what looks like a fold in her gown or maybe a tie in the center of her gown. I see the child off to our right, her left. I see the face of the child. I see the orange shoulder of the child. And I look and I see what looks like them holding hands on her knee. It would be her left knee on her right side. I see that. So I'm thinking, wow, this is pretty interesting. I wonder where this came from. Well, I think we may know. Now, Maynard Dawson, there's really a couple words to describe Maynard Dawson. Maynard Dawson was a Chicagoan by birth. He was an engineer by training. He was a fruit farmer by necessity, fruit farmer in Ludington, Michigan, and an artist by desire. So let me decode that. He was forced by his father to be an engineer, and he was employed as an engineer in 1912 or 1910. His company sent him to Europe, which he wanted to do desperately, to look at all these engineering marvels in the early 20th century in Europe. So Maynard Dawson went to Europe, and rather than studying engineering, he looked at all the old classics, right? Like the Bruges Madonna. So he came back and he told us that I'm quitting engineering. I'm going to be an artist. And as far as how you can make a living, he said, well, I'm going to go to the fruit farm we own in Ludington, Michigan, and I'm going to be a fruit farmer, and then I'll have time to do my art. Well, that didn't work out. If you're a fruit farmer, you know that you're busy 24/7, 12 months a year. So his art production dropped dramatically, but he continued to do some art. So on the European tour, I'm pretty sure he saw or knew of the Bruges Madonna by Michelangelo, 1501. And as you look at the Bruges Madonna, you can see the folds of her gown. You see that fold? That looks like a tie right in the center. And I think that's the biggest clue that he used his painting after the Bruges Madonna. But you also see the Christ child standing. And with most Madonna and Christ sculptures and paintings, when Christ is this young, he's always in the lap. He's always being held. Here he's standing. And then you see in the Bruges Madonna, they're holding hands right on top of her knee, which we see also in the mirror, Dawson, in the oil on canvas. So I think this is just a fantastic interpretation of Michelangelo's classic Bruges Madonna. Maynard Dawson was really not well known until 1966 when Grand Rapids Museum of Art did a retrospective on him, and now he's in most major galleries. Let's talk about media. And on the right is not in our collection, but it's Library of Congress, so it's freeware, if you will. It's excavated with long memory, Alabama, Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange is one of the great portrait photographers in this world. And you say she's great. Notice also how Dorothea Lange highlights the hands and the arms and the head with light. Dorothea Lange was a well-trained, experienced portrait artist, and she took these skills into the field with her. So Elizabeth Catlett, we talked a little bit about. Elizabeth Catlett did a linoleum cut. And a linoleum cut is a wood cut, only linoleum is softer. It's easier to cut. So this is a relief print. Now, my only technical thing is remember when you're doing a print from either a plate engraving or from a wood block or from a stone, you have your plate, you put your paper on it, and the image is reversed. Images are always reversed in those kinds of prints. Not serigraphs, but if you use a plate, a stone, wood, whatever, they're reversed. So you can see that Elizabeth Catlett, in fact, did her carving, did her relief print directly from Dorothea Lange's photograph. But I show this because the subjects are the same. Everything is pretty much the same, except Elizabeth Catlett also highlights the hands and the shoulders and the head like Dorothea Lange. But in the wood block, she's able to give her survivor a much stronger, sturdier look, if you will. And I think that's because of the media that's used. Because she did a wood block, Dorothea Lange did a photograph. Let me wind up my talk. We've talked about the 10 elements from the National Portrait Gallery, and I've mentioned the 11th element is the date, which again I think is important. This is a relatively new painting, new portrait in our collection. This has every single element that we've talked about, every single element that we've talked about. And it's hanging downstairs in our gallery on the American Genius. The subject matter is Scheherazade, Washington Parish. She is an artist, she's an author, she's a poet, she's an educator, she's an organizer, and a leader in the Black community of Detroit, Michigan. She's a good friend of the artist, Highland Sawyer, and has posed for him several times. But we look at this, and please go downstairs if you can next time it's available. You walk in to see this portrait, and you're immediately knocked over by the size of the portrait, the scale of the portrait, if you will. Scheherazade is probably bigger than I am. As I walk in to see the portrait, I get the feeling that I'm invading her space. That's how close I am. Highland Sawyer does a very realistic job of portraying Scheherazade, Washington Parish. As I look at pictures of her, boy, that's her. I mean, no doubt about it. So using oil on canvas, I think, allows that realism. I look at the light. I see the light coming from our left. So I see light on the light coming from the left. We see her again on our right. We see the shadow. So we see light coming from the left. That tends to highlight some things. We're going to talk about that in a second. We start with, again, facial expressions and pose, and we will go through our list. And we say facial expressions. Okay, I look at this. I see determination, perhaps anger, perhaps sadness. When you look carefully, you may even see a tear. If you go downstairs, you may even see a tear in her eye. I see objects, and objects are important. We talk about objects all the time. The most obvious object is this bat. And when you look at the bat, you'll see a Louisville Slugger logo on the bat, if you will. I see her holding the bat. I'm thinking, okay, is she paying homage to the great American pastime, baseball? Is she paying homage to those black baseball players, Jackie Robinson, Roy Campanella, and others? Or is this object a weapon? If it's a weapon, is it an offensive weapon? And when I think of offensive weapons, I think of, perhaps you all experienced some of this, in our protests in the 1960s of Vietnam, in our protests for civil rights. And National Guard, when they ran out of the axe handles, they used baseball bats as an offensive weapon. Or is it a defensive weapon? I tell the story that my mother, all less than 5 foot of her, had a baseball bat in her bedroom. She said, Jimmy, no one would care to come in my bedroom with this bat. I'm thinking, mother, it's not intimidating at 5 foot, at 80 years old. So it's a defensive weapon. Or, well, her hands are, or is this a repression? Is this a yoke? Is she in a stockade? Is this a crucifix? We don't know. But these are all things that this object makes me think of. The other object is the background, the setting, if you will, and that's the American flag. And I look at this American flag, and instantly I see that there's a star missing in the lower part of the flag. There's a star missing. I notice that the colors of the flag, the white, the reds, the blues, are pretty muddy, pretty dirty, if you will. So then I think of, well, what do the colors mean? So the color white is purity, innocence. The color red is valor or blood, and the color blue is persistence. So then I look particularly at the white areas that might be innocence or purity, if you will, and I see what kind of looks like maybe even some symbols in there. I see, like it was folded or kicked or punched or whatever. And I see a K, and I see a Y, and I see V's, and I see pyramids like on your dollar bill. So I see a lot of symbols in there. Then I think of the title. And titles are important too. Titles may be the 12th element. Titles are Columbia. Columbia is the goddess of liberty. Columbus is a feminized version of Uncle Sam. Tylen Sawyer used American icons to look through the lens, look at American icons through the lens of a black artist or black man. So this becomes a commentary about the black experience in America. So do I see determination? Yes. Do I see statements about equality and equity? I do. Do I see statements about freedom? I do. Do I see a story about Black American history? I do. And this is the power of a portrait. Thank you. Good. I have 2 minutes for questions. I did print off the elements of a portrait, and they're up here. Yes, sir.
With regards to your photograph of Winston Churchill,
Yes.
does the KI have Winston Churchill on a card?
The one I showed was the Winston Churchill that we own. Yes. So we have, I think we have 4 or 5 Karshas. Winston Churchill is one of them. That one. The other one of his smiley face is in Boston. I don't have that. Good. Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. It's just a delight to have you here. Thanks.